Well, hello, and welcome today. Welcome to the last episode in the entire seventh series. We have been walking through together on the series titled "People, Planet, and Performance: From Africa to the World." The series is a series from Africa on climate emergencies, sustainability practices in the arts, and planetary crisis. Over the past 7 weeks, we have been exploring various topics that resonate, that speak to ideas, initiatives, thinking, mindsets, and even practices around climate change within the context of performance. My name is Taiwo Afolabi, and I'm the curator, the creator, and the host of the entire series. And I have the opportunity to be working alongside amazing organizations and, of course, individuals. So special thanks to HowlRound for creating this platform to be able to have this conversation. Thanks to Center for Sustainable Practices in the Arts, CSPA, for being a partner on this project. Thanks to Center for Socially Engaged Theater at the University of Regina for being a partner. And of course, our theater company partner, Theater Missouri International. In the first episode, myself and Aliyah Kassam started by exploring what we titled Environmental Theater and Climate Justice in Africa. Aliyah and myself were preoccupied with two central questions. One was, how did we get here? And how do we move forward? It was really an interesting conversation because we came out really, reminding ourselves of the various initiatives and indigenous ways of doing things and engaging and practicing that are very central to our practice in Africa, beyond and that kind of gave us the reiterated the fact that the idea of climate issues, climate justice, climate change, all of those things, they are not new ideas, and they're not also ideas, only, promoted by the West. That for us also on the continent of Africa, it's been part of our existence and ways of doing things and thinking. Afterwards, myself and Ogutu Muraya and Philip Sabah Jehoshaphat explored the question, another topic titled Eco-Theater, Decolonizing the Colonized Narrative. And we were really interested in unearthing what are those practices that are very decolonial in its approach. We spent a lot of time talking around decolonization, colonization, and different things like that. In the third episode, Harriet Adhajaho and Adam Mapole and myself talked about retooling Green Tool for theater in Africa, insights from practitioners. It was more on design, and we were looking at sustainable practices when it comes to design. And there were a lot of examples, particularly the initiatives and interventions that practitioners, designers in the performing arts are really staging when it comes to their craft. The fourth episode, responses to climate crises and emergencies, storytelling from the performing arts. Emma Blake Morsey and Anna Maria Nabria and myself really looked into our own way of doing things, particularly as artists who are based in the diaspora. It was important to look at their own roots, storytelling, and how that has really shaped and informed their ways of doing things. Emma Blake Morsey is from Nigeria, And of course, Anna Maria Nabria has roots from Uganda. And both of them live in the UK. The fifth episode was on eco themes in action, in climate action, with Angela Emowan, and we were preoccupied with the question: what impact can eco theme genre make in the journey towards climate justice in the global South? And then last week, the sixth episode, with Naomi Haruna, we focused on performance and climate finance and sustainability. We talked about capital, not just only in the sense of money alone, but in the sense capital in a broader sense of knowledge, relationships, social capital, and different things like that. And it was really an interesting episode because we really addressed the elephant in the room, a very uncomfortable conversation. Really enjoyed the opportunity to really walk through that with Naomi. Today, which is our last episode, we have the honor to have Dr. Henry Ajumeze with us. We're going to be talking about performance and reconfiguring human and non-human species. And we're going to be starting with the question: how can eco-performance be a push for the transvaluation of human and non-human species? Now, one thing I said last week when I was sort of introducing this topic was that I think this is the only topic that had a huge number of very big words that myself and Dr. Ajumeze are going to try to break it down. It's just the nature of the beast in the topic today. But we will try our best to put that to break it down. Before we dive into things, I want to really highlight Flora again. Flora has been a project manager, really taking, she's sort of like, they are the glue that, that bring out the project together. So thanks to Flora. Thanks to Victor, our ASL interpreter. Victor has been with us right from episode 1 to this very episode. And of course, we have Amber today working with Victor. And to all our live captioners, thank you so much. Finally, before I ask Dr. Henry Ajumeze to introduce himself, one of the practices I started with from the first episode to the 5th episode was really highlighting initiatives, individuals who are doing different works across, in the area of performance and climate change and planetary justice and all of that. We didn't do that last week, and that's because the intention was for Dr. Naomi Haruna to play a video that was going to take a while, but we ended up not playing that video. So today, what I just want to highlight today is really shout out to the future generations. We've been giving a lot of shout out to, we started by giving a shout out, highlighting works of climate activists and activists like late Ken Saro-Wiwa, Professor Matai, and a host of others. And of course, those that are even alive, we've highlighted, different works. But today, I feel strongly to highlight a lot of emerging artists that we've not even heard their names. We don't even know them, but they're really in the crooks. They're working and using their energy, their craft, the little that they know and they have, they're putting everything in to speak to issues of climate change and climate issues on the continent of Africa. We want to also want to shout out to those that are yet unborn. Like Ayikoma, we say beautiful ones, yet unborn. There are a lot of unborn generations that will still thrive in this conversation. It's not just a conversation for a while. As long as we're here in this space called Earth, where in this environment, we will have a conversation. We will continue to talk about the importance of the earth, of climate, and all of that. So shout out to those that are they don't even know they will be. They are not even in existence yet, but it's something they're going to do. Forge the path forward. So thanks to those, we're saying thank you to them because it's a lot of work. And so we're shouting, shout out to all of them. The plays that they're yet to write, the movies they're yet to do, the acting, the design, the different things, because we know that all of these things, when we bring it together, make our world beautiful. With that, I'd like to introduce, I'd like to invite Dr. Henry Ajumeze to introduce himself, and we set a drum rolling. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm highly honored to be invited for this conversation. My name is Henry Ajumeze, as you have already indicated. I am originally from Nigeria. I'm a theater scholar, a cultural historian, and environmental humanist. And at the moment, I'm a lecturer of theater studies at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. My work within environmental humanities intersects between different forms of cultural studies or cultural approaches, to performance studies, intersecting between energy humanities, oceanic humanities, as well as now I'm working about critical animal studies and the ways in which, they speak, about performance. In my work, I'm very fascinated about the persistence of animals in post-colonial African performance. And that interest, derived very strongly, from my exposure in my earlier research, where I discover that animals haven't quite well been spoken about as much as they should in post-colonial, African performance. And, my observation that even though animals, have played very critical roles in African history, in post-colonial African history, as well as in colonial history, that role hasn't quite been captured, by performance. So that's where I find my work at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Henry. And I think we will start from there, because the 6th episode that we've had, we've sort of focused more on the human, which is great. But like you rightly mentioned, which is a lacuna, it's always human-centered. And a lot of scholars have talked about the human-centered approach when it comes to climate issues. It's always about this thinking where it's human-centered thinking. And there's been a call to shift to eco-centered learning, eco-centered, like this idea of moving beyond just human as the dominant factor. And so with your work, of course, we'll talk about animals, but I want to hear your perspective about that, first of all, as a way to study it, and what's the implication of that for us in the performing arts?
The implication is that, as we know, theater is a very human-centered, discipline, and it makes it very easy for other aspects of other actors to be excluded. Thankfully, the imminent, question of climate change is making us to have a rethink, and inviting us, to look beyond the human. And, all of us know what is now called the Anthropocene. We try as much as possible not to, use some of these big vocabularies. So, but we understand that we've come to a critical point in human history where we need to take, the human, and make the human, responsible, and for the climatic changes, for the loss in the biodiversity, for all of the changes we are talking about presently. So the climate change is giving us that opportunity to look beyond the human and to see ways in which, especially from the context of performance, we can look, at animals, we can look at machines, we can look at robots, we can look at, even though some of these are, technologies created by man, but we are also able to see beyond man and ways in which other aspects, that occupy the planet with man can be paid attention to, within performance and theater.
So, just theater is very human-centric. At least the kind of theater that we sort of we're used to now. Because I'm also thinking of other kinds of performances, particularly a lot of our indigenous performances that actually they have a lot of things around rituals and they well acknowledge the non-human elements of that.
Yeah.
When we talk about trans, I want us to find a way to break down some of these terms. You've identified some of the other species or actors beyond human, robots, perhaps the word of this, the other words that are not our own word. When we say push for transvaluation, what does that mean?
What it should mean to us is the need at this critical point in time in human history to see the value in the other elements that occupy this planet. We need to now begin to look at the animals. We need to tell new stories about animals. We need to tell these stories in ways that can appeal to the questions of sustainability, that can appeal to the questions of the ethics. We need to begin to care for other entities that occupy the planet for us. So transvaluation, it's, if you wish, just a new way of looking at old things, a new way of thinking about things that we never really bothered to think about in the past, and understanding that we have ignored, other questions. We've ignored what man has seen himself as a super species, that can always, stand in the middle of the planetary, considerations, and giving us that impunity, if you like, to ignore, the other elements that occupy the planet. So a transvaluation will mean for us that point in the trajectory of human history where we need to put more value in other aspects, of the planetary occupants that share the planet with man. So it's an important aspect, especially because the climate change is making all of this possible. It's quite a paradox anyway, because now we know that we haven't been telling stories about other aspects of life. We've not been telling stories about animals the way we should. So my work, for example, finds itself at this critical stage where I look very critically at African narratives, African folktales, the ways in which we tell these stories. We always assume that when we tell stories of animals the way we have done, that we are appealing to questions of what has become known as companion species, that animals have become our companion species. So we tell their stories and we tend to assume authority and authorship over how we tell these stories. And so my work looks very critically at this point of what you call now, reevaluation, if you like, because there's a need for us to re-examine how we tell these stories. If I have to draw some examples, there are quite important narratives about the tortoise in my Igbo, where I come from. Not just we have the tortoise as a subject in Igbo narrative, Igbo folktale. We have in Yoruba land they call it Jakba. And if you go to other parts of Africa, we have, the spider in Ghana, which is a very famous narrative subject that they call Anansi. Okay, if you go to South Africa, for example, they have the Jackal playing the same role. What I've discovered across all of these narrative, structures is that these animals humans have constructed narratives about these animals, but they haven't told the stories of these animals in ways that give them their dignity. They've told these stories, giving the impression of companion species, but these stories actually bring down this animal, tell their stories as if in metaphoric terms, make them human faults, tell stories that undermine, their agency, that actually excludes them, even though we think we're excluding them. So a reevaluation will mean a call for us to begin to retell our stories, to forge new ways of telling stories that can think about these animals, not in the ways in which we have not constructed them, but stories that can also make them heroes, not tricksters, not delusional agents, not animals that have nothing other than just simply perform from one trick to another. So a reevaluation from this context will mean retelling the stories, recognizing that these animals also qualify to become heroes in narratives, performing them in ways in which their dignity can be restored. Okay, all of this will constitute, if you like, just an important way of thinking about reevaluation of the ways in which narratives and performances have occurred over the time.
Interesting. When you were talking, I just remember Japa.
Yes.
I'm from Yoruba tribe, and Ijakba is one of the trickster. I think it's the major trickster. And then in Canada, a lot of the indigenous communities have hare, H-A-R-E. Is it hare? No, I'm trying to remember. Raccoon. No, it's the raccoon. It's the raccoon. Yeah. And it's really the same thing. Which is interesting. You've in what you're saying, the two ideas that I want to bring forward, among many things, obviously, and those two ideas are things that they're part of through line throughout this episode. One is the idea of what do we value, the value, and the second one is about what do we care about.
Okay.
Because a lot of the time, what we care about is a reflection of what we value. And at the heart of what you're saying and what we're focusing on in this episode is really, if we value non-human species such as animals, as we value them as not just only companion species, but as important to the ecosystem, to our living, to our survivor, to everything, then that means that we need to give care to them more. We need to give care to their voice. We need to, so that we don't tell their story and dehumanize them. Well, dehumanize them, but we tell the story in a way that they become heroes, to use your term.
Yeah.
Over the years in your research, could you speak more to some of, what do you think, what kind of values do you think we're holding on to, that we've been holding on to, that have sort of brought these animals into these, that we've relegated them into these spaces of silence, and yeah, these spaces of silence, and that will put them to?
We haven't shown much value to the non-human, especially in our performances. When I started, I talked about history, how especially post-colonial and colonial histories have, a lot of scholarship on post-colonial and colonial issues about animals have taught us differently from how cultural expressions and representations, how far we have come in terms of cultural representation. The history of colonial history about animals completely, recognize the significance of these animals. There's an important new book by Professor Saheed Aderinto, that simply outlines, the significance and the role that animals have played in our colonial history. And in that work, he's insisted on the fact that colonialism is not just about the human, but also about the non-human. So, as much as we have, colonial subjects, man as colonial subjects, we also have, animals as colonial subjects. But this hasn't happened in cultural expression. This hasn't happened in our performances. Our performances seem to suggest otherwise. So we haven't placed much value, culturally speaking, on animals, which is the reason why when we tell their stories, we ignore their individualities. When we talk about Jagba, and about the tortoise and about the spider, there's not one single spider that has been raised in any of these performances to speak about the multidimensionality in terms of literary expression, in terms of how we can capture these animals, in terms of recognizing them. If you do not recognize these animals, their identities, for example, even their gender, are often silenced. So there's hardly been any kind of value placed on animals in the way we tell the stories. So to think about valuation in terms of how we recognize these animals is to begin to rethink about how these stories are constructed and crafted. I give you a small story of a particular tortoise. They call Diego. I don't know if you know about the story of Diego. Diego, it's a species of a tortoise in Colombia, yes, which species was becoming extinct. Only 15 in their population. And then Diego was taken away, and placed in a zoo where, together with about 15 other of its population, produced about 2,000. Diego lived close to like 100 years. I'm sure Diego is still alive today. So the point I'm making is, Diego gives us an example of an animal as a global hero, such that one will begin to imagine, we will need, when we begin to think about the performance of animals, the performance of the non-human, the need to give them their names, the need to see them beyond a holistic way in which they have been captured. There is not one tortoise in the entire Yoruba repertoire of narrative making, or the entire Igbo repertoire of narrative making, that recognize one single tortoise. The same in Ghana. There has been no respect given to any of these animals. And if you do not give respect to these animals, if you metaphorize these animals, if you silence their beings, then there is no way you can care for them. It is not possible that you have care for an entity or an element that exists in a state of being and non-being.
That's right. Interesting.
So retelling the story of this animal, restoring their dignity, their individuality, crafting them in performances in a way that will appeal to a sense of multidimensionality, will ultimately begin to make us think about valuation, about the ethics of care, and about sustainability. Because that which you do not see, you cannot value. So animals exist, if you like, at the lowest, level of the planetary. That is if we even consider them as animals in the first place, because here they exist as symbols and as human foil. So all human attitudes, especially the very nasty ones, are often used to metaphorize and to stereotype the animals. And insofar as we have these stereotypes existing in our performances about animals, we really cannot think about value for these animals. Of course, in African cosmology, animals seems to play very important roles when we think about it. And it tends to make us Africans, imagine that we see animals differently from the way the West will see animals.
Of course, yeah.
Because beginning from the age of enlightenment, animals will always be considered as the mute, okay, the invisible, the opposite of modernity, that is the irrational. While in African postcolonial thinking, we'll imagine, especially drawing from our understanding and our cosmological being, that we live in the same world as animals and we share the planet. But a critical survey of this relationship in the context of performance appears to prove otherwise, inviting us to think differently, inviting us to tell new stories.
I like to push the border a little bit further. There's some animals that sort of enjoy some level of immunity mostly because of religious rights. And again, it depends on the animal in different cultures. In India, for example, there's some, cow is referenced based up due to the religion and other things like that.
Yeah.
What your work is focusing here, I think, is more than that. It's saying, can we take can we take these beyond just the religious piety? Can we recenter animals as an important aspect to our existence, and that can reflect in performance? Is that a fair
yeah, yes, it's a fair assessment of the way in which we have related with animals. I would like to say that the way in which animals are revered and respected within our religious understandings wouldn't be quite different from the way in which history has also venerated the animals as well. What we are speaking is when we begin to filter all of this through the lens of performance. How do we perform the animals? So we find that their invisibility in the way these narratives are performed also reflect in the way they are staged. Because they are staged in the absence of animals. In the Ghanaian Anase Grove, for example, where the spider is the central figure of that narrative universe, the staging of a spider show simply will find an image of the spider placed on the cyclorama. And that's that. Nothing more is done about the spider. So we find that the spider occupies the central role in the narrative and in the performance, but the spider is just an icon, just a symbol. So we don't find the spider itself. So there's a non-reproduction of the materiality of the animal in the way in which they are performed. And this is a very important absence, a very important way of, articulating the invisibility of the animal in the scheme of performance. So our religion seems to have found different ways of paying heed to the animals, just as much as our history. But how have we filtered all of this through the lens of performance? is an important question that those performance makers need to ask. A lot of performance scholars have talked about the question of performing with. We have had what other theater scholars have described as becoming animals. How do we become animals? Because when we document animals, when we perform animals, what we do is a recognition that animals can document themselves, they can perform themselves. So we give them agency when we perform them. But what kind of agency do you give animals in your performances, in narratives that purportedly subject them to different kinds of exclusion and invisibility and non-materiality? Narratives that do not recognize their individuality, their gender, and narratives that cannot, for example, iterate ways in which when we perform them, we feel for them. When we perform them, we not only feel for them, but recognize the need that performance becomes another instrument of caring for them.
Interesting. Just a lot of questions now. One of my PhD students is really her work, Luba Kozak. Her work is focusing on particularly animals, and she's looking at the representation from a visual art perspective, the representation of animals and ethics of care and different things like that. And and I bring that into the conversation because these are some of the conversations that as she reads out, does a reading, we go over her work and all that. These are questions that the question of representation, misrepresentation are critical to some of the things that you are saying. And I wanted to ask question particularly when it comes to, because a lot of the times is, again, there's so much usefulness that we consider animals to have for us. We are meant to use them. And whether that's coming from a religious perspective, where to dominate them and all of that, that's another conversation. But it's interesting that that idea of using them for our purpose also means that we use them, we do whatever we want to do to them, even when it comes to performance. And I've never thought about, the spider, for example, where, Anansi, presentation, I've never even seen a live spider or anything. It's always something on cyclogram. I've never thought about that. So this is really interesting for me as you're talking about that. I guess the question I wanted to ask with that, me going windy here now, is what are the myths, MYTH myths, that are sort of, obscured our mindset when it comes to animals? Because I know some cultures, spider, for example, that there's so much, they've demonized it, right? If you, I've heard people say over and over, for example, that if you're walking into a place and then all of a sudden you get wrapped up in spider, there's a spiritual implication and different things like that, right?
Yeah.
Whether, excuse me, whether it's true or not, that's another conversation. Yeah. But what are those myths that you want to, maybe one or two or three, that you think might be something we need to think about, that is sort of fueling this misrepresentation, this silencing, this politics of dominating animals, that you want to share, you want to share?
I give you one fine myth about the tortoise in my place where I come from. There's this proverb, Mbe Akoninu, that is, the tortoise is a common factor in all performances or in all narratives. And what this means, expressing the ubiquity of the tortoise in every narrative, also goes with yet a fine myth that the tortoise has committed so much atrocity that if you bring the tortoise in the center of a place or a stage, if you like, where its stories are being told, it will die. And the whole reason for which the tortoise must die is because it cannot stand the enormity of the atrocity it has committed. So when I look critically at this myth, at this these proverbial myths, these myths carved, like a proverb in my place, it suggests one thing: the need that the tortoise must not be materially present in the space of a reproduction of a narrative concerning the tortoise. What this myth does simply is, again, reinforcing the anthropocentric logic, placing man at the center of all of the narratives, and ensuring, for example, that the tortoise is excluded or exempted, materially exempted, from any space where a performance of the tortoise is placed. And so from one country to another, from Nigeria to Ghana, we meet the spider, to South Africa, we meet the jackal. It's the same story. It's always the same story of a trickster, the animal as the trickster. And myths are being, if you like, constructed to reinforce, this tricks that the tortoise, play, and always placing man in the center, of the narrative. But it's about the fact of the non-materiality of the tortoise, the fact that the tortoise cannot appear in the place. So if, for example, the tortoise is said to die at the point where its story is being told, so we can now also begin to think about some kind of necropolitical way of thinking about animals in the context of where, or the space where its story is being told. So invariably, the story of the tortoise has the power to determine whether the tortoise can live or to die once it is brought in the presence of the place where the story is being told. So there are different kinds of myths, but these myths are human constructed. These myths are made by man. Okay. Again, inviting us to rethink how the stories, inviting us to construct new myths, to tell new stories. Okay.
Interesting. Reconstructing new myths. What would that look like in performance for us? In the performing arts, in storytelling, we're in the business of telling story, retelling story, creating and recreating story. What would that look like?
Of course, myths are not they're not ontological. They're not inherent. I mean, they're constructed by humans.
Yeah.
So we can tell new stories by constructing new myths. By, for example, refusing to think that the tortoise can die if you bring it in the middle of a space where a story is being told. Because the whole idea now is the reality of the climate change and the fact that thinking about animals as co-occupants in the planet is an important way of caring not just for the tortoise, but also for the planet itself. Of course, you see that we have had these regimes of animal rights, especially in the Western world. And from the point of view of performance, we should think beyond using performance as a strategy or as a way of working in place for this animal as a way of protecting the animal rights. Because even the animal right itself might also seem to reinforce the same anthropocentric logic. It's just about recognizing that these animals occupy the space with us and finding ways to recognize a sense of relationality. Okay? Just recognizing that they're different from us. Many narratives about the tortoise in my homeland pay attention to why the tortoise has broken shells. Okay? So it's innately refusing to recognize the difference, that is the different embodiments of these animals, reinforcing man, if you like, as the paragon of how a creature or a species, should be like. So we need to. When I attended the conference in Ghana last month, we were treated to a whole lot of Anansi narratives, Anansi stories and performances, and I mean the storytellers will always say, let's not allow our stories to die, okay? But the point is not let's not allow our stories to die. Let's tell new stories, because the stories we are telling don't respect the animals. They don't respect the non-human. We should tell stories that will pay respect to the non-human, that will recognize them as relational elements that with whom we share the planet, and not continue, if you like, to rehash stories that can only recognize man as the center force or the mid-center of performance?
Two questions. One is, because I was going to ask a question about the human right, animal rights, not human,
okay.
Animal rights. And particularly in the West, we know that that's a very strong aspect when it comes to animal justice. There's a lot of activists and that are really using the right-based approach to thinking about agency and for animals and different things like that. What are your thoughts on that? I know that you've spoken a little bit about it, but I'd like to speak more. And perhaps maybe there's something for us to learn in performance. Maybe there's any wisdom there, even though you sort of problematized that already. But perhaps that might be maybe there's something there that could help us. I think let's address that question first, and I'll come to the second question.
Okay, animal rights, I can say is politically correct way of thinking about animals. But in essence, you think about animals, the way in which we think about animals should reflect the dynamism of our relationship with animals. I do not think animal rights reflect that kind of dynamism. I do not think animal rights and their approaches are dynamic enough to recognize animals as as sharing the planet with us, as embodying some form of cognitive values and all of that. It tends to, if you like, reinforce this intensification of animals that they require to be protected, that they need, that they don't have value on their own, if you wish. Well, of course, not in terms of value per se, but that they require to be protected. They require to, there's a sense in which one will see animal rights as too politically positioned, to exclude animals too, to make animals look not too useful for themselves, except man, comes forward as if you like the Messiah to take care of to take care of the animals. But in terms of performance, what performance should do for us is to transcend, that's if you like one-sided way of protecting the animals, to become a proper instrument of relational thinking, because performance speaks about presence. Theater is more about presence. And through theater, we're able to invite animals into our performance spaces. We're able to recognize their presence in our midst and to be able to establish, that sense of relationality, that sense of dynamism, that one can find in the way in which man should relate with other entities, on the planet. So yeah, why I would think that animal rights, one could think in terms of the politics of it all, but it doesn't quite reflect the kind of dynamism that we're talking about when we think about how we should care for animals. It's not caring for the animal for the sake of the animal. It's caring for the animal for the sake of all of us. Because the planet is the umbrella. And what happens to the other elements with which we occupy the planet happens to all of us. Extinction is no more the tragic narrative of animals as it is for man. So it's not just about protecting the animals, because when we protect animals within the logic of the animal right, it tends to suggest that animals are the only entities on this planet that requires protection, that man is safe. We're not safe. The sixth extinction that we speak about may not simply, if it has come, okay, well, that's speculative. It concerns every member of the planet, this human and the non-human, and not just about the animal. So one of the things that performance can help us to do is a reinforcement of the idea of presence. Okay, the instrumentalization of presence, that in which animals will come to our space and will perform, with animals, will become animals. Imagine animals and imagine what animals, put yourself in the position of the animals and craft narratives that will think very, very strongly about how animals, will feel if put in this position. And possibly invite animals, play with animals, use multimedia, strategies to stage animals so we feel the animals. The multidimensionality of the animals can be more felt when we place them in very close proximity in terms of how we perform animals. So performance will become even more useful when we do this than the politics of human rights protection, which seem a bit one-sided, which doesn't seem to recognize that man is also endangered.
Interesting. Interesting. I love the the thinking here around, again, that relationality, that understanding. I think bringing, again, understanding there is a power imbalance here, and we've reiterated that narrative over and over, but that we need to bring the narrative to that point where we're in relationship with, and not consider them ourselves as over them, and then we can talk for them, we can do whatever we want to do to them, but that bring them into that space where we can start seeing them presence, that presence becoming a very ethical attribute in this conversation. This is really, really interesting. And for me, I'm also thinking as a practitioner, what would, how that changes not just only the dynamics, but when we're talking about working in community, we're devising performances and all of that, how that can also help us to start understanding our communities in a better. Because there are times that when we bring an animal into the community, it changes the dynamics. You start hearing, oh, this animal, we used to have it here, but then they're no longer here because of this and all of that. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was co-directing and devising a performance, a story with a particular indigenous community here in Canada. And then I was, wearing my director's hat, there was a particular name that, as they were saying it, I wanted to sort of tweak it a little bit just for rhyme and all that. And I remember one of the indigenous participants said, no, we can't change that. And I'm like, well, why not? It's the name of a particular river. So they told us to stop the rehearsal to invite one of the elders, Auntie. So we stopped the rehearsal for that day, and then we invited Auntie the following day. And then Auntie took us through a time of explaining why we cannot change the name of that river. Okay. Because that's the only claim that they have, that land belongs to them. That the moment we change it, we bastardize it, or because of aesthetics and all of that, right? We want to change it, that we start passing on the wrong thing. And then before we know it, we start creating a culture of eroding their history. Yeah. And that was really an interesting, this aha moment for me, because I'm like, yeah, oh my goodness, that I didn't even think about that. Yeah. And so when we start thinking of these new stories, like I saying, creating new stories, new means that give these animals presence and these non-human species, understanding that we're in relationship with one another, and then giving them space to speak and all that, we start creating a new set of learning, awareness, understanding, which I think is really very critical to whatever it is we are doing now. We need a context of climate change. Everything is important now. And so it won't be just one-sided narrative of we as the, as this, but we also start awakening, a new set of awakening to a sense of responsibility and co-relation, relationship. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you.
Interesting. The other question I was going to ask is really about, taking a step back into our indigenous ways of doing things. And that could mean different things depending on what part of the world and all that. Are there lessons, are there things that we can learn from our culture? Well, maybe prior to the colonization, who knows, or maybe afterwards, I don't know, that you think, because I want us to, we always say, let's start from where we're at, right? Before going into the unknown, let's start from the known, if it's possible. Are there things that, practices or thinking that you see that are already existing there, that you've seen in your work, that you've discovered through your work, rather, that we can start from there? Because all of this may look new to many people. And it's like, so how do I start as a director, as an actor? Is there anything I can go to that, or a practice that is there already that I can just, start learning, from there? Is there any example that you might steer us towards?
One thing I can say, I mean, from my own background, where I come from, we have a relationship with the rabbit in my place. We don't eat rabbit in my place, and there's a story behind that's if you like, it's now like a taboo to eat rabbits. Yeah, foreigners will come to the town, and eat rabbits, and we have heard about some dire consequences of doing that. And the story has been that during the war, the rabbits kind of helped our people. A stampede of rabbits kind of distorted the footprints of people running into the bush. So when the soldiers came to the place, they said, "Oh, human beings don't stay in this place," and they went back. My people recognized this act of the rabbit as a way, as a kind of political intervention, and if you like, as a kind of social intervention in their lives. And because of that, they don't eat rabbits. This small story, it's common across different places in Africa where we have taboos, where people don't touch this tree, where people don't eat fish. We also have a river in my place. They call it Oboshi. The fish from the place, we don't eat that. Oboshi is known as the mother of the town. So we don't eat fish from Oboshi. And it is also known that that if you can't swim, as long as you're from a community, regardless of the depth to which you have swum in that river, it will never drown you, because Oboshi protects the children. I mean, the whole idea of this story is that as theater makers, we should figure out some of this relationship between communities and the non-human, between the rivers and between the river, the animals that populate different places or spaces where they want to make performances, and pay heed to some of these, because some of those are protective narratives, protective myths, if you like, that not just think about the history of the relationship between that animal and the community, but also help us in ecological science, as a way of protecting the climate change, as a way of so it could serve as a historical marker for something that might have happened in the past, but it subsists now, if you like, and very strongly too, as something that helps us in terms of taming the climate change in those communities. And I think that theater should pay attention to some of these kinds of stories, and recognize them for what they are, recognize the history, recognize the religion behind it. And just like you said, I think you made an allusion to, certain kind of connections that way. So as a theater maker, I think also, I remember often when you want to open up some of the conversations we've had in the past, you pay respect to the land where your university is located. I think it's something very common in North America. And this should offer us insights into how art should connect with life that we live. Okay, the fact that art is an extension of life, and if art is an extension of life, why can't art think of the history behind these trees, these rivers, these animals? Because it doesn't seem to me as if the way in which we make art consider some of these histories and some of these religious injunctions. So, and that's the focus of my work. The fact that we tend to tell stories of animals without recognizing the histories and the religious connections that these animals enjoy in real life, as if art seemed to have found a way to disconnect itself from religion and from history. Okay, so when we are thinking very strongly about climate change, we should also think about the historicities of these rivers, these animals, and these forms of non-human that share the planet with us. And I think that those who make art should pay respect to some of these connections, these relationships in how they make their art.
This is very powerful. Really love the fact that we're ending this series on this note, because what we've identified right from the beginning is really what are value systems, how capital, how colonization, neoliberalism, globalization, and on and on and on. And really at the heart of it, how human greed. Let's give it different names. Different names. The humans' desire to dominate the other. The 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 humans' tendency for these ungodly or unholy atrocity of wanting to silence the other, whether through gender, through race, whatever term we want to give it. That there is a need for us to start rethinking our value system, for us to start asking ourselves, what do we care about? What do we want to care about? Why do we want to care about it? And perhaps take a step back and look at where we're from, our root, ROOTS. What are those things that folks have cared about? And how have they done that? So what are the practices that have been in existence, so that we can then start asking ourselves, why am I doing things the way I'm doing it now? Has it always been like this? Can it be different? Can it change? And that by the time we start asking ourselves those questions, there is something that it changes. We're thinking globally, but that we're acting locally and personally, whether it's within the context of climate change, like this entire episode has been on, or it's within the context of theater, performance, which we're focusing on, or beyond that, that all these questions start guiding and guarding our modus operandi. And I think that this is what you're offering us today, in the context of non-human species, for us to start thinking of these various ideas. How do we need to start changing our mindsets, and so that we can forge a new future, a future that our children's seventh generations to come, we can have something more meaningful, better to hand over to them. So deeply thank you so much, Dr. Henry Ajumeze, for taking the time to speak today, really eloquently, about these intersection between the human and non-human species, that ultimately we have a relationship. We have a responsibility to forge a relationship. And that relationship is there. The only thing is that it's lopsided. It's Armstrong, man, as a human being rather, is always the one in charge. And maybe we need to change it differently. Like really, when we're really not, we're giving ourselves way too much than we can actually. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for facilitating this.
Thank you. I would want to really conclude this 2 more minutes, and where we come to the end of the entire episode, of the entire series. The entire 7 episodes have been really eye-opening, and we've had a lot of requests and questions around, can it be used in classrooms and all that? And so our response is yes. These are conversations that were curated to really, bring practitioners and scholars to talk about all of these issues as outlined at the beginning. And so we do encourage the resources to be used in whatever ways that we find it meaningful and useful. And with that, I want to say thank you again to HowlRound for creating a platform to have this conversation over the past 7 weeks. Thanks to Center for Sustainable Practices Within the Arts for being a partner. Thanks to Flo Gomez, our project manager, who has been the one in charge of gluing us together and ensuring that the project was well run. Thanks to Center for Socially Engaged Theater, which is the center at the University of Regina. And I want to say that all the episodes, except I believe first episode, I did them on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Mischief and Mistiz Nations, where University of Regina is located, and the center, which Center for Social Engaged Theater, which I am the director. And of course, thanks to our theater partner, Theater Ministry International, both in Nigeria and Canada. Well, with that, we want to say I do hope that you find all of these amazing conversations useful. Thanks to Victor and to Amber again, and to our live captioners. please be on the lookout for there are 2 articles that would summarize all of these conversations. We're hoping that that's going to be, we're going to send that out at some point. And then all of these will be packaged together. Again, all of those links, we're happy to send that out to different spaces. And really special thanks to all our invited guests who have taken the time to talk to us from the first episode to the last episode. So with that on my end, really thank you for being part of all this, and been a fun and really exciting journey to think about this series, and to think about it, to curate it, to create it, and of course to host it. And I've had a lot of sleepless nights of reading and reading and reading and reading, and finding ways to dissect and think through some of these things with our guests. So on my end, I'm signing out. Thank you so much. And thank you again to Dr. Henry Ajumeze for taking the time to conclude this series with us. And with that, I will say thank you so much. And hopefully, my last word here is this, that we can all think globally when it comes to issues of climate change, particularly for us in the performing arts. We can think globally, we can act locally and personally, whether as a director or theater company or theater initiatives or whatever, in whatever capacity and spaces that we're engaging and working, that all of these ideas, we can start guiding our work, and we can create our work and contribute meaningfully to creating a world that is better than we made it. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.